Recently, famous radio show host and personal finance guru Dave Ramsey made headlines by saying he's perfectly comfortable with an 8% withdrawal rate in retirement. Critics were quick to respond, calling his advice scary, dangerous, and flat out wrong. So who's right? Find out today on Retire Smarter.
Hey, another edition of Retire Smarter is here. I'm Walter Storholt alongside Tyler Emrick, certified financial planner, also a chartered financial analyst, wealth advisor with the True Wealth Design team. Here for another great episode. Very intrigued by both your headline, Tyler, and your teaser. Always enjoy talking about Dave Ramsey's advice and guidance because he is so popular out there. And sometimes people really disagree with what he has to say. Sometimes people are obviously really, really big proponents of everything he has to say and take it as gospel. So it makes it fun to talk about, that is for sure, which I think is one of his main missions, is to be an entertainer. So we get to tap into that a little bit on today's episode. But before we dive into all of that, we just had Thanksgiving. You are recording from home today because of a little bit of snowfall. So things have been busy at the Emrick household, it sounds like.
That's right. Yes, Thanksgiving was wonderful. Belly is still full. Nice. I think we got almost 3 days of leftovers, which was great. I'm Thanksgiving out though. I could, so we'll see. Maybe when Christmas rolls around, we'll be back on some of the mashed potatoes, cheesy potatoes, ham, turkey, all that other good stuff.
After we record today, I'm polishing off the rest of the sweet potato casserole, and then I think we'll be almost done with all our leftovers.
Nice. That's pretty good. That's pretty good considering we're almost a week out from Thanksgiving.
Yeah. We've still got some turkey. That's going to get frozen and thrown. That's going to get thrown in the freezer for maybe a turkey soup or something later on.
Yeah, no, that's good. And then, of course, being in Northeast Ohio, we got hit with a little bit of snow here to welcome us into the end of November, early December. Not too much, just a little bit of dusting, but just enough to keep me in the household and playing dad for today. So
nice. Well, we are glad that you are still able to join us for the show today and get some great information out there for folks. And let's dive into that content today because, I don't know, Tyler, we're here at episode 136. And I don't know if in those previous 135 episodes, if we've ever, certainly we haven't had an episode that centered around a piece of Dave Ramsey advice or comment. Maybe Kevin at some point mentioned him in passing and in a response, but I really can't remember a time where we've brought him up in 135 episodes. So well done. I feel like that's an accomplishment.
Look at us finding new ways to explore the world of finance, but he really outdid himself this time. I mean, you mentioned entertainer as you were kind of setting up the show a bit, and he really made some headlines with this one, and he was really diving into and talking about retirees and what we call safe withdrawal rates. So what he was getting at is that he recommended first retirees invest 100% of their assets in stocks, from which that comment in itself, I think
you could do a whole episode on that specific thing, right? Yeah.
Yes. But then he goes on to say from which they could withdraw 8% per year from the portfolio's starting value, with each year's expenditures adjusted for inflation. So if I break that down a little bit and put some numbers behind it, essentially is what he's saying is, let's say you're heading into retirement and you've got $500,000 in your portfolio. What Dave's saying is you take that $500,000, 8% of it, roughly $40,000, and that is the number that you can safely withdraw throughout retirement and not run out. And not only can you withdraw that number, but each year that number can be increased by whatever inflation happens to be for that prior year. So if inflation was 3% in the scenario that we're walking through, that would increase the $40,000 distribution up to $41,200. So it really doesn't have anything to do with how your portfolio grows over the course of your retirement. He's just saying, hey, in year one, take your balance. This will be a nice, easy rule that you can follow. 8% you can pull out per year, increasing with inflation, which I don't know if you've had any exposure to safe withdrawal rates, Walter, but that is about double what most of the
Yes.
research tells us, or what most people tend to lean on as that safe
I've always heard that
withdrawal rate.
4% rule has been talked about. And some people say it's too conservative. Some people say it's too aggressive. But we're kind of really blowing that out of the water at an 8% conversation.
We are. And Dave actually spoke to that. He's like, hey, he's just not a fan of that safe withdrawal rate research. He actually blasted the researchers for being what he calls super nerds that live in their mother's basement with calculators. One of those super nerds we actually had on the podcast. I don't know if you remember. I think it was back in the earlier episodes. Kevin interviewed him over two. David Blanchett.
Oh, yes. I remember the David Blanchett. That was a great interview.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of great work by David, but essentially he's, picking their research apart a bit and really expanding on it, saying, nope, that 3, 4, 5% withdrawal rate's not even close. You should be closer to an 8%. So I guess the question becomes is how did he even get there? Right. Mm-hmm. And he actually was nice enough to break it down for us. So I'll give you the math a little bit. Right. So by his analysis, he's saying, hey, if you're all invested in stocks, you're making roughly 12% per year in good mutual funds, because the S&P 500 average is close to that per year. He says if you back out inflation, over the last 80 years, he says 4% is a good assumption there. You simply take 12, subtract 4, and you are leaving with 8, because that 4% accounts for those inflation increases. And then the 8% withdrawal rate is what you're left. He's like perfectly comfortable withdrawing 8% per year. And conservatively, he said maybe 7, but said no way is it closer to that 3, 4, 5% range that a lot of those researchers seem to fall back on. So seems pretty reasonable, right? I mean, 12% return per year. Yeah. The math breaks down pretty basic,
Simple.
Or at least in his mind.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, and what we'll dive into a little bit, I think he's a little wrong on his math. And there's two areas that we will dive into a bit today. And it seems like he's not grasping the difference between what we call geometric returns, which is what you earn on an investment, and arithmetic returns, which is a simple average. And he doesn't really appreciate how a all-stock portfolio increases sequence of return risk. So headline those two a bit. Again, difference between geometric returns and Oh, come on. That was early.
Gotta hit you with the
Kevin would be proud. Isn't that a little early? Just a little bit early?
I don't think so. When you drop geometric returns and arithmetic returns back to back, it seems like you're asking for it. So there you go. It's been a few episodes since you had one.
Well, beauty about it is, hey, we'll dive into them in a little bit more detail throughout the podcast here. But yes, those two things I feel like he's missing a bit, right? The difference between those returns, and then not really appreciating how that 100% stock portfolio increase is what we call sequence of return risk. A lot of those super nerds he referenced had a lot to say about his 8% withdrawal rate, and they back tested and did some data on it and said, hey, if you would have followed this 8% withdrawal rule while holding a 4-stock portfolio in the early 2000s, you would have ran out of money in as little as almost 13, 14 years. So I'll break down the math behind that a little bit, as we always seem to do here in the podcast, and get the details. Yeah. But let's peel back the onion a bit and dive into each of those issues, I guess, if you want to call them that we have with what Dave's trying to say here. So geometric returns and arithmetic returns. So essentially what we're getting at here is just because you average 12% return per year doesn't mean that a retiree's portfolio is going to grow by 12% return per year. So simply saying, hey, the S&P 500 is going to average that, or at least it has historically averaged that. If I have 100% in stocks, boom, there you go. In practical application, there's other things to consider. And this geometric return, we feel, is a better representation of that. So let me give you a little bit of breakdown on the numbers. So let's say you have $1 million portfolio. You retire, and in year one, your investments fall by 20%. Okay. So at the end of year one of retirement, you're down to $800,000.
Which is very realistic. I mean, look at 2020.
We just went through that.
Look at this past
2022.
year, right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So $1 million portfolio at the end of year one drops to 800. And then let's say the next year you have a good year and you earn 25%. So you're back up to $1 million, right? So 25% at 800K. So over the course of 2 years, your portfolio really has not changed at all. You started with $1 million and you still have $1 million left. But if we take an average over those 2 years, negative 20% and positive 25%, that means your average annual return or arithmetic return is 2.5%. Okay. Although your geometric return is zero, right? Your dollars haven't changed. 1 million at the beginning, 1 million at the end. That I can barely say it too. I've said it too many times, haven't I?
No worries,
through the pod. But is it 2.5% return per year? Because again, negative 20 in year one, positive 25% in year two. So
I feel like this is we're sports analysts and we're massaging the stats to fit our narrative, right? Like,
that's a good point on there.
Just
putting
it into perspective. Oh, you 2.5%. No, it's actually zero. Well, it depends on how you look at it,
Well, and it could be very odd, right? Especially heading into a year. You talk about those retirees that possibly retired in early 2020 or in 2008 when we had a major market crisis, and your account values drop by a significant dollar amount. That can be detrimental to your overall retirement plan, and it hurts a lot more if one of those scenarios happen early in retirement, which is a wonderful segue to that issue number 2 that we had, is that having a 100% stock portfolio increases that sequence of return risk, because the more volatile your portfolio is, the more risk you have of retiring into one of those bad markets and it hurting your jumpstart to retirement, and can really put you in a tough situation if you have these hard and fast rules saying, hey, I'm going to withdraw 8% every single year, not adjust with my portfolio changing.
Yeah.
So if we break down the math on that a little bit, how impactful that sequence of return risk can be, we just go back to that prior comment when I said, hey, a lot of these super nerds that do a lot with this safe withdrawal rate, when they look back through the data and say, well, what if we created a portfolio that Dave Ramsey said would get us this roughly 12 to 14% return per year. And let's say that, that was a retiree that had that type of portfolio and they retired right at the end of 2000. So 2001 was their first year of retirement. And essentially the numbers, the way they broke down, I think it's important for us to maybe dive into that just a smidge so the listeners can hear and see how those balances change. So in that, if you were that individual, first year of retirement, January 2001, $1 million saved for retirement, you pull out $80,000 per year. That's the 8%. So in 2001, your investments would have slipped by about 7.5%. And then, of course, you would have withdrawn your $80,000. Year 2, portfolio would have fell again, almost 18% it would have fell. And again, you would have withdrawn out $80,000 plus whatever inflation was that particular year. So just 2 years into retirement, your balance is now just over $600,000, down from $1 million, because you've pulled out the money that you're living off of, and your portfolio has lost 7.5% in year 1 and almost 18% in year 2. Now, hey, just inevitably, as the stock market tends to do, has a bounce back year. So in year 3, you have a 31% return, which brings your average up pretty good. And then over the next 4 years, you're averaging around 12% return per year. And boom, 2008 hits. And your portfolio falls by almost 38%. So from day 1 of retirement, January 2001, now you're sitting at the end of 2008. You've withdrawn your 8% return per year. Your portfolio is down to almost little over $300,000 left because you've experienced these big downturns in the market and you've maintained that big withdrawal rate that keeps pulling down those assets over time. Your average return over those first 9 years isn't terrible. It's a little over 5%. Again, you're down to just a few $100,000 and your withdrawal has increased to almost $100,000 per year because remember, we're increasing that each year with inflation. So we extrapolate that out over the remaining few years and you're running out of money in 2013 or 2014. Just what? 14 years into retirement.
Yeah.
And if you take the average return over those entire time periods, it's just under 10% return per year. So not too far off that 12% that Dave Ramsey says that we could average, but you're completely out of money at that time. So those impacts of those returns or a negative year in the market can really hurt retirees as they're pulling a big chunk of money out.
No kidding. That's amazing to see that illustration and just how fast you run out. And now, granted, that's two big hits back to back, right? The 01 drop, and then again having the the drop in 08. But there's nothing to say that we wouldn't be in that pattern right now with the drop from the pandemic or post, and then next year something happens, and you're creating a similar scenario. It could happen at any point in time when we retire. We don't know.
Right. Well, and two, I think a lot of people don't quite understand or may understand the volatility that's in the market. And one of the key things here that Dave Ramsey is saying is, hey, you leave your money 100% in stocks. And very rarely, every retiree is different, but there's a reason why most retirees go into retirement with a diversified portfolio and target a lower amount in stocks than, say, their entire portfolio. Not every retiree, but this impact and the volatility and having to live off of it can really be a double whammy if it hits you not only early in retirement, but over the course of, say, a 10-year time period, because there are 10-year time periods where the stock market does not return that average of 12% return per year.
It's also interesting, I think, if you look at this story that you drew out for us here, Tyler, in real life, it probably doesn't play out, even though those are the real numbers over those years. A real person who would be in this scenario is probably changing their game plan halfway through this scenario, not continuing to withdraw at that percentage rate. But that's just as big of a story, right? So maybe they're not running out of money in 2013 and 14, but now maybe they're trying to live off of half of what they'd intended to live off of to help stretch that money out. And now that's creating a whole nother host of problems as people try to change the game plan, years into retirement.
Correct. Or really going into retirement and not understanding that could be a major risk.
Yeah.
And understanding that, hey, if you take on this much stock exposure, you take on this high of a withdrawal rate, could be consequences down the road depending on what happens in the market. And talking through that and understanding that and what that might look like, I think is extremely valuable. So wonderful point there. Well, you're correct.
Somebody living off of $80,000 all of a sudden being asked to live off of 30 or 40 then changes their their lifestyle.
That's right. Well, and I think as Dave Ramsey was kind of, exploring this idea and making this almost outlandish comment, I think he's almost overcorrecting, because the old rule and a lot of that data that we look at that says, hey, what is the safe withdrawal rate, does tend to settle into that 3 to 4% withdrawal per year range. And Dave says, well, hey, if you're telling retirees they can only pull out 3 to 4% return per year, and they look at having, say, $1 million and they can only get, say, $40,000 a year from it, a lot of individuals might go and say, wow, I need a lot more save for retirement. I can't live off of $40,000 a year. I need to have $2 million. And what that does is... It's almost depressing
knowing that you've saved $1 million and now you're only living off of 30 to 40. Like, what was the point of working so hard and saving so much? And that's almost seems unrealistic, probably, that people who have earned that much and saved that much are going to then have the lifestyle that meets that.
Well, and I think that's where our biggest issue with these rules in general, whether it's 8%, I mean, a lot of them go off of the old 4% rule, pulling out 4% return per year. I mean, I think Kevin even did a podcast just on the 4% rule. We might be stretching pretty far back on us there, Walt.
Episode 95, it looks like. Yes, Retirement Rules Gone Awry, part of a great series. It's still applicable today, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think the approach, or to think about retirement and what can you live off of and how much can you withdraw off of your assets per year, it takes a little bit more digging, and using these rules can sort of get you in trouble. It might be a fine starting point, but that's all they are. And there's a few reasons for that. And I think there's a few tidbits here that I'll share that I think are a little bit better of an approach, as opposed to just that hard and fast rule. The beginning part, it really starts with understanding your spending and what that's going to look like over the course of retirement. As financial advisors, we read a lot of academic journals and a lot of research trying to understand where are retirees spending their money, and how does that change over the course of retirement? And I think the data is pretty clear that, you take an individual, say, retires in their early 60s, and extrapolate that over the course of a 30-year retirement. Generally, what happens is each year of retirement, retiree spending decrease a bit. And that decrease actually is shown to happen all the way into, say, your mid-80s. And then it's going to increase in your mid-80s and start to increase again. As you're kind of visualize it and you're listening to me talk, they call it the retirement smile. I mean, you can Google this. A lot of research done on it. But, you boil down your assets and go into retirement saying that, hey, every single year of retirement, I'm going to need 4% of my portfolio per year to live off of. Well, that's not really taking an accurate representation of how your spending is going to change over the course of retirement. I mean, you might pay off your house. Cars might get paid off. Maybe you're purchasing less cars in your 80s. Maybe you're not traveling as much in your 70s and 80s. So, retirees might need a little bit more from those assets early in retirement, and that might dwindle off and change as they go over the course of retirement. So that retirement spending and understanding what you're going to need to retire is point and key number one. And then the other approach and the other thing I think we need to be looking at is, well, what other assets do you have to live off of besides just maybe a 401k and an IRA? And the biggest one that comes to my mind is Social Security. You might have a pension plan. And a lot of times when you kick in, say, Social Security, for example, there's a lot of strategy that comes into play there, especially for individuals looking to retire, say, in their early 60s. You can wait and delay and take your Social Security all the way up into 70 and continue to get increases. And a lot of times for a family of two who both have Social Security benefits, it might make sense for at least one of those individuals, the higher earning spouse, to delay benefits later. So what that means is you might need a little bit more money to live off of from your assets early in retirement, and that withdrawal rate or percentage might be very high for, say, the first 5 or 6 years of retirement. And then when you kick in something like Social Security, you're not going to need as much from your assets to live off of because Social Security is going to replicate or going to replace that. So thinking through your situation and what triggers and sources of, let's call it, income that you're going to have into retirement and when those start is extremely helpful as you're kind of looking at the entire picture. And then finally, when we look at a safe withdrawal rate and running out of money towards, or having it last you, through a long and healthy retirement, there's some considerations there. And I think looking at it maybe from a statistical point of view is a little bit more valuable. And what do I mean by that? So if you take Dave Ramsey's strategy and say, hey, how many scenarios could we run that where that 8% withdrawal rate becomes successful? Hey, it lasts you a 30-year retirement. You pull out 8% return per year. How long or how many times do you actually come out and you're okay? And we call that, fancy term for that, it's called Monte Carlo simulation. And the way you can kind of think about that is really the way that I think about just a basic financial plan, right? It's, hey, you have this group of assets, 401ks, IRAs, all the like that you're going to use in retirement. We have a good idea, or hopefully you have a very good idea how your spending is going to look and how it's going to change over the course of retirement. But what we do not know is how much money you're going to earn in interest or on your investments as you have them. So what we do from a financial planning standpoint is we test that. So we go each year of retirement, say you need to get those expenses, and assume you get a different rate of return and extrapolate that out each year over a 30-year time horizon and say, hey, at the end, do you have money left? Okay, hey, that's great. That's a successful plan. Let's go back and let's assume that you retire into a poor market and you lose a lot early in retirement. Do you still run out of money? So if you run a scenario like that, taking Dave Ramsey's advice, slightly over half the time you actually run out of money or you have a successful. So it's almost a coin flip as to if your money is going to last you 30 years. If you pull that time horizon down and say it's only a 20-year time horizon, about 2/3 of those occasions, the strategy actually comes out successful. So you can use that information to help make better decisions now. And a lot of the families that I talk with wouldn't want to leave their retirement and say, hey, there's a coin flip that you're going to run out of money in 30 years.
Yeah, it doesn't sound very attractive.
No, not at all. We call those success rates. We talk about them almost on every meeting that we have to make sure that families are kind of tracking in the right direction and make sure we can have that spending conversation should we need to. Understanding those numbers and looking at it from that frame of mind, I think adds more value than just saying, hey, I'm heading into retirement. Can I pull out 4% or 6% or 8% return per year? Or not return, but withdraw per year and live off of it, kind of shut the doors, close it, and never look at it again, to your point. Things change. And I think having a much more dynamic approach is more valuable and helpful.
Yeah, that's great, Tyler. Great breakdown of all of this. I think it's important to remember the context for everything, kind of like we were talking about with those stats there briefly. And it's the context of Dave Ramsey when you hear advice from him. Keep in mind that often he's speaking to a very large, very broad audience, on the radio or on his YouTube channels or whatever the case may be from where he's kind of speaking about these things. And he's dealing with people getting out of debt, and he's trying to get people to be more confident in managing money. He doesn't want you to live your life in fear. And so this information that he's shared here, this sort of advice, kind of tracks with that, right? He's saying, quit being a scaredy cat about your money going to, the earth is crumbling and the world's ending and you need to go be a miser and live in a hole. Like, have some confidence, live your life to the fullest, get out there and do it. And so he's kind of following that mentality, to me, at least a little bit with this. But I think you're right. It's like an overcorrection. It's like, all right, oversimplification, overcorrection. Hopefully people don't take that as gospel on the surface and do a little bit more digging and a little bit more research and talk to somebody like you, Tyler, that can put their plan through these different stress tests, through these different simulations to really get an idea of the potential success of whatever strategy they follow. It's nice if this stuff could all be super simple and super easy, but if you want to maximize your opportunities and your chances, like, you got to go below the hood. You got to go below the surface and look into these details. And I know that that's what you guys do at True Wealth Design each and every day with your clients. And if you're listening to today's show and wanting to go into that kind of deeper level of planning, that's what Tyler, Kevin, and the great True Wealth Design team are doing all the time. And you can get a complimentary 15-minute call with an experienced advisor on the team to see if you'd be a good fit to work with one another. It's very easy to set up that visit. Just go to truewealthdesign.com. Click the Are We Right For You button and schedule your 15-minute call just like that. No obligation to do anything. It's just a kind of a complimentary meeting to see if you'd be a good fit to work with one another and what could be done for your situation going forward. Just begin that conversation very easily. You can also call 855-TWD-PLAN. That's 855-TWD-PLAN, or again, truewealthdesign.com. We'll put all that contact info in the description of today's show. Tyler, well done. Really appreciate your guidance on this today, and we look forward to catching up with you again in a few weeks.
Oh, always. It was a pleasure.
Congrats on your egghead alert today as well, by the way.
A good deal.
Geometric and arithmetic returns. Wow. That was definitely a new term to share with us on the show, but made a ton of sense, and I definitely feel like I can retire smarter after today's episode. We will talk to everybody again next time. Come back and join us for another edition of Retire Smarter. Until then, take care.
Information provided is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment, tax, or legal advice. Information is obtained from sources that are deemed to be reliable, but their accurateness and completeness cannot be guaranteed. All performance reference is historical and not an indication of future results. Benchmark indices are hypothetical and do not include any investment fees.